and welcome to Conversations with Matt DeLockery. A few series ago, we took our first look at the question of God, namely, is there one of those things? A God. The basic idea I suggested was that if there is a God of some sort, then there's a good chance that if we look at the world around us, then we can probably find some of his, her, or its tracks. Remember, we haven't defined this God or gods. At this point, we're simply talking about some sort of divine figure or figures. We're not even going to try to say whether there is one or multiple gods, though for simplicity's sake, I'm going to go with a singular when I talk, just so I don't have to keep saying singular and plural for everything. Anyway, in that previous series, we looked at the world of human actions and tried to understand whether what we saw made better sense with either the existence of a deity or not. In this series, we're going to do the same sort of thing, only this time, instead of looking at humans, we're going to look at something bigger. We're going to look at the entire universe. We're going to go back to the beginning and try to see whether what we find makes better sense with a hypothesis of a deity or without that hypothesis. And so we're going to do this without reference to any religious text. As you know, I'm a Christian, so that means no Bible. In this series, it's just going to be science and philosophy. Something that may interest you is that this particular argument for God's existence was originally created by a Muslim in the 11th century named Al-Ghazali. He put together the original philosophical arguments that made up this argument. Then in the 20th century, a Christian apologist named William Lane Craig brought the argument back, added scientific evidence, and popularized it. He named this version of the cosmological argument the Kalam Cosmological argument in honor of its Muslim roots. So, lest you should think this is a Christian thing only, it's not. And, given its Muslim heritage, it should be obvious that the God that this argument would point to, if it's successful, is not the Christian God. But we'll get into what this argument does and does not actually accomplish later. Now, I want to get to the argument, but I have one final thing to say first. Our look at this argument, this particular way of investigating the question of God's existence, is going to take a while. Specifically, this argument is going to take 6 episodes to cover, which actually isn't that ridiculous, since it could have taken a lot longer. The problem is, if you're not familiar with these sorts of arguments, it will definitely take longer than you want it to. At some point, some of you may be screaming at me just to get to the conclusion, but the reason we go in depth is 2 parts. 1, we want to be thorough, and we want to find out what is actually true. And 2, some of the things that seem obvious to one person may not be obvious to another. So, we go over everything. Anyway, that's enough introduction. Let's get to the argument. The Kalam Cosmological argument, like other members in the cosmological argument family, looks for a first cause or origin to everything we see today. So, to begin this discussion, we need to talk about causality. The idea behind this argument is that something cannot come from nothing, and we see something, so everything we see must come from somewhere. The more formalized version of this argument is, whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore, the universe had a cause. But to begin this argument, we need to talk about causality, or cause and effect. Immediately, though, we run into a problem. How exactly can you prove cause and effect? Usually when you try to prove something, you start with a special situation and back up to a more general rule to find the proof. This ball that I threw up into the air fell back to the ground because of the law of gravity. Unless the ball is accelerated upward quickly enough to escape the Earth's gravitational field, it will return to Earth, just like any object would, because that's how gravity and physics work. See how that works? The special situation, the ball I threw in the air, was explained by the general rule, the law of gravity. The problem we run into is this. What is more general than cause and effect? What general rule can we look to that's more foundational than that? It's not going to be based on any scientific law, because the laws that humans discover are based on things like cause and effect. Personally, I really can't think of something that's more general than cause and effect that it might be based on. Cause and effect, therefore, is probably a good candidate for what is known in philosophy as a brute fact. a brute fact is something that simply cannot be explained. It doesn't mean that it's not true, it's just that it cannot be explained. Think of a child who constantly asks the question, why? Why do you have to water plants? Because if you don't, they'll die. Why? Because plants need to live. Why? Because they need water for something called photosynthesis. It's how plants make their food. Why? Even if you don't have children, you see where this is going. At some point, your knowledge of biology will run out. Well, maybe it won't. Maybe you know a lot about biology, and chemistry, and physics, and can give answers to the why question all the way to the end of human knowledge. And by this point, you have almost certainly lost your child, though if you haven't, he or she is probably very special. Anyway, at some point, the line of questioning will take you to such a basic level that no more explanation is possible. Here you will get to something like, why is X the way it is? The answer is going to be something like, I don't know, it just is. When you get to that point, assuming your limitation is not just that your knowledge ran out, you might have reached a brute fact. I argue that cause and effect is one of those things. I think it is a brute fact. Without appealing to a deity, I cannot think of anything that is more basic than cause and effect. So when we're talking about the origin of the universe, and say that whatever begins to exist has a cause, it's sort of impossible to explain why effects have causes. What could you give that's more basic than cause and effect? The interesting thing is that some people who hear this argument actually question whether cause and effect is a thing. You see, this argument for God's existence has two premises, or two main points, if you will. 1. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. And 2. The universe began to exist. So, if both of those are true, then it must mean that the universe has a cause. See how that works? We're going to spend several episodes talking about the second premise, the universe began to exist. But the thing is, there is actually really good evidence for that. So, what happens is that since the second premise is really hard to refute, some people come back and deny the first premise. They say that there is no cause and effect. That's why we're spending so much time on this now. It seems like a really obvious thing that isn't worth going over, but we actually need to go over it because people do deny it. Now, I said that cause and effect is a brute fact. It's something that's just built into our world, and I think most people would agree with me. But there are several specific objections that we need to cover. And in addressing some of these, I think you will find further reasons to think that cause and effect really is a thing. First up is the idea that something can actually come from nothing, uncaused. The whole idea behind this argument is that we see the universe coming into existence at some point in the finite past. And for most people on either side of the argument, i.e., whether you believe in a deity or not, they'd say that it came into existence out of nothing. So, since there is nothing in this physical world that could have caused it, there must have been something from outside this physical world that caused it, what some of us call God. At least that's how people who support this argument reason. However, there are some scientists, Lawrence Krauss, for example, who have said that the universe coming into being out of nothing really isn't that big a deal. He says that there are examples of things coming into existence out of nothing all the time. The universe, on his view, came into existence out of nothing. The problem with this is that what the physicist means by nothing and what the philosopher means by nothing are not the same thing. Listen to what Krauss describes as nothing in his book, A Universe from Nothing, in the chapter called Nothing is Something. He says, quote, "First, I want to be clear about what kind of nothing I am discussing at the moment. This is the simplest version of nothing, namely, empty space." End quote. Shortly after this, he will say things like, quote, "Empty space can have a non-zero energy associated with it, even in the absence of any matter or radiation." End quote. And he'll also talk about how, quote, "The energy contained within empty space grows as the universe grows." End quote. Finally, he says, quote, "It certainly seems sensible to imagine that, a priori, matter cannot spontaneously arise from empty space, so that something, in this sense, cannot arise from nothing. But when we allow for the dynamics of gravity and quantum mechanics, we find that this common sense notion is no longer true." End quote. Now, as everyone who has been listening to this podcast for a while knows, I'm a New Testament guy. Physics is not my thing. I have a layman's level interest in it, especially as it relates to topics like the origin of the universe, but this is way outside of my field of expertise. However, the one point that I do want to make is something that I think it does not take an advanced degree in physics to see. Krauss's nothing is not the same thing as the philosopher's nothing, or what you and I and most people think when we think of nothing. First of all, he talks about nothing as empty space. Well, space actually is something. In this same chapter, he talks about space expanding. So if space can expand, then as far as I understand it, it has at least one property, which makes it something. Second, his empty space may be empty of matter, but he says himself that it is not empty of energy. Remember, he said that it had non-zero energy associated with it. This means that it has at least some energy. Again, that's another something. Finally, he talks about the dynamics of gravity and quantum mechanics, so there are actual physical laws associated with nothing as well. On Krauss's view, then, nothing includes at least 1. Empty physical space, 2. Some quantity of energy, and 3. Physical laws like quantum mechanics and gravity. This is a very different idea of nothing than the philosopher's version of nothing. When the philosopher says nothing, he means not anything. Or to put it another way, it is false to say that there is anything. All of this is a fairly long explanation to make a single point. When the scientist is saying that something can come from nothing, he is not talking about the same thing as when a philosopher is talking about something coming or not coming from nothing. And most of us, when we talk about nothing, think of the philosopher's nothing. We think of not anything. In this argument, when we get into the universe coming into being out of nothing, despite the fact that a lot of physics is going to be involved, we're going to be talking about the philosopher's nothing. The reason for this is that whether or not the universe we currently see comes about in the manner that Krauss describes is an interesting question, but it's not the same question we're looking for an answer to. How the universe formed is a really neat question, but it's not the same question as whether or not it needed some divine help or not to get it going. So the physicist is talking about how the universe got from its initial state of existence, from as far back as math and observations will take us, to where we are now. We are asking the question, how did the universe go from not anything to something? Later in this series, we're going to be talking about a variety of different models for how the universe came into being. What I want to be clear about is that most of the actual stuff that makes up those models really isn't relevant to our question. We are only interested in answering one question. Has the universe always existed, or has it only been around for a finite period of time? That's it. If it has always existed, then there's no need for a cause, because we said that whatever begins to exist has a cause. So if it has always existed, then it doesn't need a cause. But if it began to exist, then we need to look at what sort of cause it might have had. Okay, so the idea that the universe can come from nothing doesn't really work, because a scientist means something different by the word nothing than we're talking about here. So what's next? Another objection I want to cover to the whole cause and effect thing is the idea that while every effect we experience in our lives needs to have a cause, perhaps the universe itself didn't need to have a cause. On this view, cause and effect is really only something that happens because of physical laws that exist in our universe. However, those laws may not apply to the universe as a whole. After all, they exist inside the universe, but they may not reach outside the bubble, if you will, and apply to the universe itself. Here's the thing with this objection. Why would you think that cause and effect is something based on this particular universe? To say that it's just a feature of this universe and that it doesn't apply to the universe itself would mean that there is something about this universe that makes cause and effect the way things are. On this view, it would be like the strength of gravity being exactly what it is and not either stronger or weaker. But why would we think that cause and effect is like a physical law? Just looking at it, it would make more sense for it to be like a metaphysical law that governs all reality, whether this universe or any other. To me, cause and effect seems more like the law of non-contradiction than the law of gravity. For those of you who don't know, the law of non-contradiction states that A cannot be both A and not A at the same time and in the same way. For example, I cannot be both 5'10" and not 5'10" at the same time. Now, I used to be shorter, and when I get older, I may be again, but I cannot be two different heights at the same time. Cause and effect seems to be more like the law of non-contradiction. It's a metaphysical principle that seems to stay the same no matter where you might be. Something like the strength of gravity could easily be different in another universe, but I don't really know how cause and effect could be. So, I don't really know that these two things can be compared, and because of that, I don't think this objection works out. I think the whole issue of cause and effect is much easier to bring home to people if you ask them to think about what things would be like if it were false. For any of you who might still be on the fence with this idea that effects have causes, ask yourself this: what would happen if this premise were false? What would it mean to say whatever begins to exist has a cause isn't true? Well, it would mean that anything and everything could and should just pop into existence out of nothing, uncaused. So imagine you're hanging out with your friend and everything's going fine. Then all of a sudden, he or she is eaten by a bear that just popped into existence out of nothing. The thing is, you might be sad at the loss of your friend, but you really shouldn't be surprised. After all, these things happen. But of course we all know that these things don't just happen. And if bears can't pop into existence out of nothing, what makes universes so special? Why do they get to pop into existence out of nothing and nothing else can? Finally, the last thing we need to cover is how this relates to God. Many will ask, okay, well, if everything had a cause, then what caused God? You can answer this objection yourself if you merely go back and read the first premise. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. God does not begin to exist, he has always existed. Therefore, he does not need a cause. Now, before you accuse me of making a special exception for God, let me point something out to you. For a long time, up until very recently, many scientists believed that the universe itself had always existed. This was a pretty common view. The reason that just about no one holds this view anymore is because of science. The data is just not there to support this view. Philosophically, however, there is nothing wrong with saying that the universe has always existed. There is nothing logically contradictory about that statement. The universe could have always existed from eternity past and never needed a cause. Again, philosophically it works out. It's just that it doesn't work out scientifically. So there's no reason that God couldn't have existed from eternity past just like the universe could have. Now, whether there is a God or not is another question, and we're trying to answer it. But there's nothing logically contradictory in saying that a God would not need a cause. Okay, we're going to stop here for today. I know we've covered a lot of material. I hope it hasn't been too much for you. In the other episodes in the series, I'm going to do basically what I did in this one. I'm going to do the best that I can to explain things as simply as I can. The problem is that these sorts of topics are often kind of new to a lot of us, and that all by itself makes them a bit harder. Of course, I could just not be explaining things very well. I'm giving it my best. I hope it's enough. You might try re-listening to an episode you have particular trouble with. Sometimes going through it again will make a difference. Again, though, I might be the problem. So let me point you to another resource that might be helpful. It's a book called On Guard by William Lane Craig, the guy I told you about at the beginning of the episode who named the argument we're talking about. It's written for the average person, and even though it talks about a lot of difficult concepts, it's readable. I put a link to it in the description, so check it out if you get a chance. Also, I apologize for taking so long for getting this series out since my last one. Some of these take a little longer than others to put together. I'm not sure how many of you follow me on Twitter or Facebook, but if you do, I will let you know when things are taking a little longer than normal, and when new episodes are out when I haven't come out with any in a few weeks. You can follow me on Twitter at Matt Delacre or Facebook at facebook.com/MattDelacre. So check those out so we can keep in touch. And of course, if you have a question about any of this stuff, let me know on either Twitter or Facebook. I'll talk to you next week.